Today we're going to find out if this is a good idea. The RTX 3080 is easily one of the most sought after GPUs right now, and particularly the Founders Edition model, which is one of the most compact options out there. This seems like the perfect fit for the dream high-performance ITX gaming machine. The 3080 FE can easily fit in tiny cases like the DNA 4 and Ghost S1, but there's something else you need to consider, and that's the unconventional flow-through cooler. So today that's what we're going to find out. Can you realistically make the 3080 Founders Edition work in these sandwich layout cases? Let's find out. But before we go shoving this card into some small form factor cases, we need to get a baseline of performance to see how this GPU performs without being constrained by case airflow. So on an open test bench, the 3080 FE settles in at 72 degrees C with a fan speed of 1650 RPM and boost clock of around 1920 MHz. The closer that the following ITX cases can perform to these values, the better. Now I will be doing a complete video on undervolting the 3080 and 3090 that'll be coming out next week, but for now here are the settings that I've used for a couple of tests that you'll see in a minute. The RTX 3080 FE boosts to around 1920 MHz with a voltage of 1.025 volts, and we can stabilize that clock speed at just 893 millivolts for some nice reductions in power, thermals, and noise, but no drop in performance. Do note that higher clocked aftermarket cards will require more voltage to stabilize, unless you additionally go ahead and underclock the card, which is something that I don't recommend. Now before I went ahead and tested the flow-through cooler in a sandwich layout case, I wanted to get kind of another baseline of performance of what you could expect in an ITX case with a more conventional layout, such as the Ncase M1. And here the results were surprisingly good, because not only does the Ncase M1 not constrain the flow-through cooler on the new Founders Edition card, it actually encourages it. On one end of the card, you essentially have a push-pull fan setup, which is incredibly effective, with one fan pushing fresh air onto the heatsink and another one directly exhausting that upwards. And then on the other end, you've got a decent amount of heat just being dumped straight out of the case. This means that thermal performance is only marginally worse than compared to an open test bench, but of course we do have more noise due to the additional fans. Still though, at 41 dBA 30 centimeters from the build, that's a very comfortable noise level to be around. When undervolting the GPU, things get even more impressive, with thermal performance now almost tying what we had on the open bench. This outlines how well the airflow setup in the M1 works with the new Founders Edition card. Under 70 degrees C here is seriously impressive when you consider how much power is going through this GPU. A similar case, the Cooler Master NR200 should provide very close thermal performance here, but likely a bit better, seeing as it's bigger and can accommodate two top exhaust fans. Other similar layout cases like the Lee & Lee TU150 and Streacom DA2 should also work well with the new flow-through cooler, but may run a bit warmer due to less total airflow. But now let's move on to the sandwich layout, and for that we are using the Ghost S1. I voiced my concerns about sandwich layout cases like this when it comes to this new unique cooler design in previous videos, and now we're going to see how valid those claims actually are. And here you can see exactly why. With the 3080 Founders Edition fully installed, take a look at just how little clearance the GPU exhaust fan has against the spine of the case. It's barely a couple millimeters. And the result is an absolute disaster. In a stock Ghost S1 with no additional fans, the 3080 FE fights to stay within a reasonable operating temperature by reducing both clock speed and power, and by ramping both fans up to 2300 RPM. It's clear that the hot air from the GPU's exhaust fan is just completely trapped with nowhere to go, and at this point I can confirm that that area of the case was far too hot to touch. But let's see if we can overcome this by adding two slim 120mm exhaust fans at the top of the case via the small top hat. This doesn't really increase the case volume significantly, but it does dramatically improve the volume of air moving through the case, seeing as there aren't any fans otherwise here. You can install a 120mm fan at the bottom of the S1 underneath the power supply, and we'll take a look at the thermals there in just a minute. And with the small top top hat, we do get a big improvement. It's still very warm for a card that shouldn't be, don't get me wrong, but the 3080 is now running at the full 320 watts with no throttling back. We can further reduce this by enabling our undervolt profile, and that brings things down to a much more reasonable level, 77 degrees C now with a much lower fan speed and noise level too. But with a pair of full-sized 120mm fans instead, we can potentially move more air through the case with the medium top hat and reduce thermals a bit more. Here the improvement wasn't as much as I expected, and this represents kind of the limit of how much you can improve thermals for this setup with a single pair of fans. By rearranging the cables though, I was able to fit an additional 120mm fan underneath the power supply, but the only thing this did was increase noise. We don't get a thermal reduction here at all, but that makes sense because it's pretty much just blowing at the bottom metal part of the graphics card. The last thing that I tried was independently controlling the two fans on the RTX 3080 and spinning the blower fan a bit faster than the flow-through fan, as the blower end of the card is a bit more effective at removing heat in this setup. The results here weren't as good as I'd hoped though, just a 1 degree drop at the same noise level, but this is definitely worth considering for this layout. So this setup can work. We're definitely in a safe thermal range now, but I can't help but feel at this point that the case and GPU are just completely fighting each other. The sandwich layout completely goes against the intended airflow path of the new Founders Edition card, and the poor thermal performance here clearly illustrates that. These results would be even worse in the Dan A4 SFX and NZXT H1, which are also sandwich layout cases but don't support active GPU exhaust. You're basically sentencing this GPU to a very hard life in those cases. And unfortunately, as far as I can see, this is the only RTX 3080 model that will fit in either the Ghost S1 or Dan A4. As for the formed T1, which is the highest airflow sandwich layout case that you can buy, you can actually offset the power supply away from the GPU exhaust fan to create a bit more breathing room. So performance there will likely be a few degrees better than the Ghost S1, and if so, I would definitely consider that to be a practical airflow setup. I do have a second T1 on the way, and I do plan to test this when that arrives. And I am still very surprised at how well this card works in the N-Case M1. Here the case airflow and thermal design of the card complement each other very well. If you are after a 3080 and you can get your hands on an FE card, that would be recommended. But the bottom line is that yes, while the RTX 3080 Founders Edition is actually a pretty cool running card as a whole, the flow-through cooler can be a big problem in the sandwich layout, and you need both active cooling and undervolting just to make it a viable setup. At the end of the day though, if you do have a Ghost S1 and you are looking to upgrade to the 3080, this is the only option that I know that will fit in this case. So with these two popular ITX case layouts tested, we do get some dramatically different results, and that should be enough to apply to other cases that use the same or very similar layout. The new flow-through cooler is really not playing around when it comes to sandwich layout cases, and it does require a lot of airflow and undervolting to kind of make it a viable setup and to make it at least tolerable sitting next to while gaming. But as always, a huge thanks for watching. Consider subscribing down below if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next one.